we continued to explore the nature of emptiness. Several years ago, when visiting Israel, after one of the storytelling sessions, a young man chased after us and asked the question. He was obviously moved by the stories. And he said, "Tell me, what is the secret of your storytelling?" And it was merely said to him, "I am the story." What does this mean for us? What is this state that we arrive at when existence, knowledge and bliss are no longer three separate dimensions of life, but one state of Sat Chit Ananda, sometimes called the ocean of oneness? What is it that occurs in our lives when we abide in this ocean? Now we know it explicitly because after meditating, that state is clearly present for us. Unlike in our daily lives when we're out and about pursuing some task. So in this state, now, after meditating, that is clearly present for us, let's see what this story is for us. It's the story of a king called Solomon. He was not the King Solomon that's famous throughout history, but his name nevertheless was King Solomon. And this King Solomon had a daughter, a beautiful daughter, by the name of Shaloma. Now Shaloma was not only extraordinarily beautiful, but she was caring and kind, gentle in all ways. And very often Shaloma would go out into the city in the garb of an ordinary citizen, listening to people, hearing about their lives, taking interest in what it was that life was for them. But after some time, it was seen by the king and members of the court that Princess Shaloma no longer went out into the city. She sat. She still ate and drank. She didn't lose weight, but from time to time she could be heard to sigh very deeply. And so the king was very, very concerned about her. So he called in physicians and pundits of all kinds from near and far to see if they could find some means to cure her of her malaise. And there were all kinds of beings who came with different potions and lotions and means of being able to draw her out. And they all got into discussion amongst themselves and could not come to any agreement at all, because none of what they were doing seemed to be doing any good at all. Except one day, one of these pundits stood up and shouted, "I know what it is. The princess is bored. She's bored with life. She's bored, as everyone will be in time to come, when they have all the trappings of life. She's bored." So they decided that to end this boredom, because she was now at marriageable age, that marriage would be the thing to cure her. So this was presented to the king, and the king spoke to the princess and said, it's decided that you're now at that time of life where you should be married, and so I'm going to call all of the princes of all of the lands, and you can choose a husband. Well, messages were sent out, and princes from near and far came and were paraded in front of the princess. And after some time, King Solomon said to the Princess Shaloma, "Now, which of these princes do you choose to be your husband?" And she said, "None of them." And the king got quite angry. "Well," said the princess, "can you blame me? Not one of these princes was worth that much. Look at the one who came and all he could talk about was his horses and his animals. Did he care about the people in his realm? He knew more about his champion horses than he did about his people. What about that prince who came regaled in diamonds and gems and jewels? All he cared about was his own appearance and what people thought about him. Did he think about those people in his realm?" And so she went on, giving descriptions of all of these princes. And finally she said, "How can I choose to have a husband who cares nothing about others, only about themselves? I want none of them." So, in desperation, King Solomon called the soothsayers, and it was told by them that the princess would marry a poor man. So when King Solomon said to Princess Shaloma that this is what the soothsayers had said, all she said was, "So be it." But King Solomon got very angry with this. He said, I'm done with you. I'm banishing you from this kingdom. So that very evening, he had his courtiers take the princess and place her in a turret in the middle of a far away lake where she was under guard. "I don't want to see your face," said King Solomon. Well, it so happened that amongst the members of King Solomon's people was a lowly shepherd. This lowly shepherd had a relationship with life and nature that was special, because every day he awoke and he listened. He listened to the sounds of the birds. He walked out in the grass in his bare feet to feel the feel of the dew between his toes. He loved his animals, his sheep, his goats and his oxen, as though they were his friends and people. And he would often contemplate, if only I were able to read and write, perhaps I could express what it is that I feel and know about nature. But as it happened, this young man was lying out in the pastures, his animals gathered around him, and he fell asleep. And when he awoke, it was coming towards evening time, and he had to hurry and get his animals under cover before the night fell. But as he was hastily driving his sheep, his goats, and his oxen back to their safe haven, a huge bird called a ziz came swooping down from the sky. And even as he hastened to take his animals to safety, the giant creature got its claws into one of his oxen, and even though he pulled, he was not able to get the beast out of the beak of this great creature. But he hung on to the legs of the oxen with all his might, and the huge bird lifted off and soared with the oxen and the young man clinging tightly to the oxen's legs. The ziz bird flew higher and higher and farther and farther until it became tired with the weight of the beast it was carrying, along with the weight of the young man. So it so happened that it landed on the turret of the edifice in which the princess was ensconced, out in the middle of the great lake. The young man was quite stunned, but he was able to take out his knife and stab it through the tongue of the bird that was still trying to grip the great oxen. And so the bird flew off, leaving the young man and the carcass of the oxen on the parapet of the turret. The young man was exhausted and fell asleep. But the next day he awoke, and when he looked up, he saw the most beautiful being he had ever set eyes on. He wondered where he was. He had no idea of his location. But this beautiful being, of course we know her as Princess Salome, asked the young man, "Who are you and where do you come from?" And all he could do was to relate his experience of the last day, when the princess took him and gave him fresh clothing and asked him to bathe and refresh himself, and she fed him sweetmeats by her own hand. And then she said to him, "You're a very handsome man." And he blushed, and he couldn't but ask her what she was doing here. And she said, "Oh, excuse me, I must go to the top of the turret. It is time for me to wait." And he said, "What are you waiting for?" And she said, "I have said that I will marry the first man who appears on my turret." And he looked at her gently and said, "But I am that man." And she said, "Oh, then you are my husband." From that moment on, it was as though they were wed, and they lived blissfully. But then the princess said one day to her husband, "We cannot stay here. How can we leave this place? The young man, now the husband, said, I have an idea. The carcass of the oxen is still here, and we can lure this bird. And so it came about that he created a basket in which he and the princess could stay and attach it to the carcass of the animal that was placed out where it was visible to the giant creature, the Ziz bird. And of course, so it happened. The giant bird came by, and as it lifted the carcass of the oxen, it also lifted the basket in which the young man and the princess were seated on silken cushions, and it soared up into the sky. As it soared, again it became tired of the weight that it was carrying. And in an endeavor to relinquish this added weight, it soared low and banged itself against the turrets of another building, which of course happened to be the palace of King Solomon. At that moment, the young man cut the ropes which attached it to the oxen and the bird flew off free of its added burden, leaving the young man and the princess. Of course, the courtiers of the court quickly came and recognized the princess. In the meantime, during the time that the princess was absent, her father, King Solomon, had grown very morose and sad. But he had started to go out into the streets of his city, seeing how people lived, listening to what they had to say. And he started endeavors with the members of his court to increase the education and the well-being of his populace. So when King Solomon greeted his daughter, there was some humility in the joyfulness with which he embraced her, and he said, I have learned much. Please forgive me. And he asked, who is this young man with you? And the princess said, this is your son-in-law, my husband. Oh, said King Solomon, from which kingdom is he a prince? And the princess replied, life is his kingdom, and he is a prince amongst men. Of course, we know the end of the story. They lived happily ever after and had lots of sons. This state, Satchitananda, existence, knowledge, and bliss, also spoken of as the ocean of oneness, and also in the words of the great poet Fierce, the ground of unknowing where the rose always blooms. What is this state? What is this place? If we can give it a name, we have passed through the aperture called the gateless gate in Buddhist terms, where we know, live, understand